There's a quiet change happening right now that most people only notice in fragments. A headline here, a short clip there, a viral post that feels unsettling but hard to fully explain. It is not loud, it is not announced, and it does not come with protests or banners. It is simply men choosing to step away. If you stay with me until the end of this video, you will understand why this shift matters, why it is accelerating, and why the consequences are far bigger than most people are prepared to admit. Before we get into it, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more angry guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. Your support helps this channel reach the people who are already sensing that something is off but cannot yet put it into words. I also want to tell you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets, how to grow your wealth, and how to buy, sell, and trade crypto with clarity instead of hype, go check it out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. Every bit of support helps keep this channel independent and focused on telling the truth as clearly as possible. Now, let us talk about what is really happening, because the surface level explanation is not enough. This is not about anger, and it is not about revenge. It is about exhaustion. For decades, men were told that they were the problem. They were told that their instincts were wrong, their boundaries were outdated, and their role in society was something that needed to be corrected, reshaped, or apologized for. This message did not come from one place. It came from media, from institutions, from workplaces, from schools, and from online culture. It was repeated often enough that many men internalized it without even realizing they had done so. At first, most men tried to adapt. They listened. They adjusted their language. They stepped back. They tried to be more agreeable, more flexible, more understanding. They accepted new rules that were often unclear and constantly changing. They were told that this discomfort was necessary progress, that it was temporary, and that if they just kept trying harder, everything would eventually balance out, but balance never came. Instead, the expectations increased while the appreciation decreased. Over time, something subtle but powerful began to happen. Men started to notice that no matter how much they adjusted, the criticism did not stop. The goalposts kept moving. Masculinity was framed as something that needed constant supervision. Normal male behavior was pathologized. Assertiveness became arrogance. Silence became indifference. Presence became intrusion. Absence became abandonment. There was no winning condition, only constant evaluation. For a long time, men stayed in the game anyway. They worked, they paid, they built, they contributed. They were told that their value came from what they provided, not from who they were. So they provided. And yet, even as they did, they were increasingly portrayed as unnecessary, replaceable, or suspect. The message was confusing. Society still depended on men, but it no longer seemed to like them very much. Eventually, a different question started to surface in quiet moments. What if I simply stop trying to win a game that has no finish line? What if peace is found not in arguing, persuading, or proving anything, but in stepping away altogether? That question is where everything changed. What we are seeing now is not men organizing against society, it is men opting out of unnecessary conflict. Many are choosing simpler lives, smaller living spaces, fewer possessions, less noise, less explanation. They are reducing exposure to environments that feel hostile or draining. They are focusing on health, financial stability, skills, and personal interests. This is not rebellion, it is minimalism applied to social life. A key detail that often gets missed is that this withdrawal is not dramatic. It does not look like rage, it looks like silence. It looks like men declining to participate in conversations that feel predetermined. It looks like fewer marriages, fewer long-term commitments, fewer attempts to impress or perform. It looks like men choosing solitude not because they hate people, but because solitude has become the only place where they are not constantly judged. At the same time, a very different tone has emerged in parts of online culture. You see videos where women express frustration, confusion, or concern about the absence of men. You see discussions about loneliness, about a lack of connection, about the difficulty of finding partners who are willing to commit. These are real feelings and they deserve to be acknowledged. But there is a disconnect between these expressions and the past messaging that told men they were not needed or that their presence was inherently problematic. When people say they do not understand why men are leaving, it often sounds sincere. But understanding requires memory. It requires acknowledging that years of criticism, distrust, and one sided expectations have consequences. You cannot spend decades telling a group that they are harmful and then act surprised when they decide to remove themselves from the equation. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable because it forces society to confront a truth it would rather avoid. Stability does not come from shaming people into compliance, it comes from mutual respect. When respect erodes on one side for too long, disengagement becomes rational. Some observers describe this moment as a social tipping point. Others call it a quiet collapse. The truth is that it does not need a dramatic label to be significant. When large numbers of men decide that participation no longer offers a fair exchange, the systems built on that participation start to strain. Relationships strain, communities strain, economic assumptions strain. None of this happens overnight, and none of it happens evenly. But it does happen. It is also important to clarify what this is not. This is not about punishing women. It is not about wishing harm on anyone. Most men who walk away are not interested in conflict at all. They are interested in calm. They are interested in predictability. They are interested in environments where effort is met with appreciation instead of suspicion. When they cannot find that in traditional social structures, they build it elsewhere or alone. There is a reason so many men describe this shift as choosing peace. Peace does not require applause. Peace does not argue. Peace does not trend. It simply exists quietly. And once someone experiences it, they are reluctant to give it up. That is why this movement, if you even want to call it that, is so difficult to reverse. You cannot shame someone back into stress once they have tasted calm. Another aspect worth addressing is how language itself has changed the atmosphere. Words matter because they shape expectations. When men hear repeated narratives that frame them as dangerous, unreliable, or inherently flawed, even if those narratives are presented as jokes or abstract critiques, they internalize the risk. Many men decide that the safest option is distance, not because they believe the worst accusations, but because they do not want to be constantly navigating misunderstandings or potential consequences. This risk calculation becomes especially strong when the rewards of participation are unclear. If commitment comes with high expectations, low appreciation, and constant scrutiny, while solitude offers stability, autonomy, and quiet, the choice becomes obvious for many. This is not bitterness, it is cost benefit analysis applied to life. As this pattern spreads, it creates a feedback loop. The more men withdraw, the more noticeable their absence becomes. The more noticeable the absence, the more people ask where they went. And the more that question is asked without addressing the underlying causes, the more men feel validated in their decision to stay away. Some critics try to dismiss this as a phase or an overreaction. They argue that society has always gone through shifts like this. There is some truth there. History does move in cycles, but cycles still have consequences while they are happening, and pretending that disengagement on this scale is meaningless is a mistake. One of the most revealing moments in recent years has been watching public discussions about safety, trust, and perception. When large groups openly express fear or distrust toward men as a category, even rhetorically, it sends a message. Many men respond not with anger, but with resignation. They conclude that if they are seen as a problem by default, The most respectful thing they can do is remove themselves from the situation. What makes this moment unique is how open and visible that conclusion has become. In the past, men might have endured quietly. Today, they share their reasoning, their routines, and their sense of relief after stepping away. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. These stories resonate because they reflect a shared experience that was previously unspoken. Like, this is why attempts to shame men back into participation often fail. You cannot guilt someone into caring about a system that has consistently communicated that their contribution is unwanted or suspect. You cannot demand engagement while offering no sense of belonging, and you cannot rebuild trust without first acknowledging how it was broken. The idea that men are simply abandoning responsibility misses the deeper reality. Many of these men still work, still contribute economically, still support themselves, and still follow the law. What they are abandoning is unnecessary emotional labor in environments that feel adversarial. They are opting out of narratives that frame them as problems to be managed rather than people to be understood. And as this continues, society faces a choice. It can continue to talk past this issue, reducing it to slogans and surface level arguments, or it can listen carefully to what disengagement is signaling, not as a threat, but as feedback. Feedback that says something fundamental in the social contract has been neglected. This does not mean returning to the past. It does not mean ignoring real issues or concerns. It means recognizing that progress cannot be built on one sided contempt. It means understanding that peace is not the enemy of equality. It means remembering that cooperation requires goodwill on all sides. Men who have walked away are not waiting to be convinced. They are not staging a protest. They are living their lives quietly, often with less stress than before. That is what makes this shift so powerful and so difficult to reverse. Once someone reorganizes their life around calm, noise loses its influence. When large numbers of men quietly reduce their participation in social expectations, it changes the texture of everyday life in ways that are easy to miss at first. Fewer conversations feel balanced, fewer interactions feel reciprocal. There's a subtle thinning of cooperation that shows up in places people do not immediately connect to relationships or culture. Workplaces feel different. Communities feel less cohesive. There is less informal mentorship, less volunteering, less willingness to go beyond minimum requirements. None of this comes from hostility, it comes from detachment. Detachment is often misunderstood as apathy, but they are not the same thing. Apathy implies not caring at all. Detachment implies caring enough to step back rather than continue investing energy where it feels wasted. Many men still care deeply about stability, fairness, and the future. What they no longer care about is performing emotional labor for systems that treat them as interchangeable or suspect. This distinction matters because it explains why so many men remain productive while also remaining distant. One of the most consistent patterns you hear from men who have stepped away is not rage, but relief. Relief from constant second guessing, relief from having to interpret shifting social rules, relief from feeling that every word or action could be misinterpreted. When people hear that relief, it can be uncomfortable because it suggests that the previous environment was not merely flawed, but actively stressful. That realization forces a reckoning with how normal that stress had become. Stress, when normalized, becomes invisible to those who do not experience it. For years, many men were told that discomfort was simply part of growth, that they needed to unlearn instincts, suppress impulses, and constantly self monitor. Some of that reflection was healthy, some of it was necessary, but when self monitoring becomes perpetual, it erodes confidence and trust. Eventually, people stop engaging not because they are weak, but because they are tired. This fatigue did not appear overnight, it built slowly through countless small interactions, comments that dismissed concerns, jokes that framed men as incompetent or dangerous, policies that assumed guilt before behavior, cultural narratives that flattened complexity into caricature. Each individual instance might seem minor. Together, they created an atmosphere where men felt less like participants and more like liabilities. When that atmosphere persists long enough, people adapt. Adaptation does not always look like protest. Often it looks like optimization. Men began optimizing for environments where effort produced predictable outcomes. They invested in skills rather than approval. They prioritized savings over displays of status. They chose routines over drama. This shift toward minimalism is not ideological, it is practical. Minimalism, in this context, is not about owning less for aesthetic reasons. It is about removing variables that introduce unnecessary risk or stress. Relationships for many men began to feel like high risk variables with unclear returns. That does not mean relationships are inherently negative. It means the perceived cost to benefit ratio changed. At the same time, many institutions continued to operate under assumptions that no longer held. They assumed men would continue to show up out of obligation, tradition, or guilt. They assumed participation was automatic. When that participation quietly declined, the response was often confusion rather than introspection. Why are men not engaging? Why are they not committing? Why are they not trying harder? Those questions often miss the most obvious answer because trying harder no longer produced better results. In fact, in many cases, it produced worse ones. The more men tried to accommodate, the more invisible their effort became. Appreciation turned into expectation. Expectation turned into entitlement. And entitlement, when left unchecked, dissolves goodwill. Goodwill is fragile. It cannot be commanded. It must be cultivated. Once it is gone, it is difficult to restore, especially if its absence is denied. This is where the current moment becomes pivotal. Society can either acknowledge that goodwill has been strained and work to rebuild it, or it can continue to treat disengagement as a moral failure rather than a rational response. Another layer of this issue involves how masculinity itself has been discussed. For years, masculinity was framed primarily in terms of what it should not be. Do not be aggressive, do not be dominant, do not be assertive, do not be silent, do not be loud. The list grew longer, while positive definitions grew fewer. When identity is defined mostly by prohibitions, people eventually disengage from the identity altogether. Men were encouraged to be vulnerable, which in principle is healthy. But vulnerability without safety becomes exposure. When vulnerability was met with dismissal, mockery, or later used against them, men learned quickly. They learned that silence was safer, that distance was protection, that solitude was control. Control is a theme that comes up often, but not in the way critics assume. This is not about controlling others, it is about controlling one's environment. When external environments feel unpredictable or hostile, people seek internal order. They simplify, they withdraw, they focus on what they can manage. This is why so many men describe their withdrawal as peaceful rather than lonely. Loneliness implies a lack of connection that is painful. Peace implies a lack of conflict that is calming. The difference is not trivial. Many men report feeling less lonely alone than they did in relationships or social settings where they felt constantly seen but not understood. It is also important to note that this shift is not limited to any one age group. Younger men, having watched older generations struggle, are making different choices earlier. They are delaying or avoiding commitments that seem risky. They are prioritizing flexibility. Older men, having already paid the cost of long term imbalance, are opting out after experience rather than theory. As these patterns spread, they influence norms. When fewer men pursue traditional milestones, those milestones lose some of their cultural power. Marriage, cohabitation, and long term partnership become optional rather than expected. That shift creates anxiety for systems built on predictability. You can see it in discussions about demographics, labor markets, and social support structures. An often overlooked consequence of disengagement is how it changes negotiation dynamics. When one side no longer feels compelled to negotiate, leverage shifts. Men who are content alone are not easily pressured by fear of isolation. That changes how conversations unfold, both personally and culturally. Demands lose their force when the recipient is willing to walk away. This willingness to walk away is not about dominance, it is about boundaries. Boundaries become clearer when people are no longer desperate for validation. Many men report that stepping back allowed them to rediscover interest, creativity, and focus that had been buried under constant accommodation. That rediscovery reinforces the decision to remain disengaged. Some critics argue that this trend is selfish, that it prioritizes individual comfort over collective responsibility. But responsibility must be reciprocal to be sustainable. When one side feels perpetually responsible for the emotional climate while receiving little consideration in return, burnout is inevitable. Opting out is not a rejection of society, it is a rejection of imbalance. There is also a misconception that men who disengage are avoiding accountability. In reality, many are holding themselves accountable in different ways. They manage their finances carefully, they invest in physical health, they develop practical skills allowing independence. They prepare for uncertainty rather than relying on systems they no longer trust to be fair. Trust is the foundation of any social contract. When trust erodes, contracts become brittle. People look for exits. This is true in business, in relationships, and in culture. Men walking away are not burning bridges, they are simply no longer crossing them. Another factor worth examining is how online discourse amplifies extremes. Sensational narratives get attention, nuanced ones do not. This creates the illusion that conflict is more intense than it actually is. Many men disengage quietly without adopting any extreme ideology. They do not announce their departure, they simply stop showing up. This quiet exit is precisely why the trend is often underestimated. Loud movements attract scrutiny, silent ones reshape reality. By the time institutions notice the impact, patterns are already established. Recruitment becomes harder, participation drops, incentives fail to motivate. Attempts to reverse this through messaging alone are unlikely to succeed. You cannot persuade people to re enter environments they associate with stress by promising abstract ideals. Change requires structural adjustments. It requires restoring mutual respect. It requires acknowledging that past approaches created unintended consequences. One of the most difficult parts of this conversation is acknowledging that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Many cultural shifts were driven by a desire for fairness and safety. Those goals matter. But when implementation ignores human psychology and social dynamics, backlash takes the form of withdrawal rather than confrontation. Withdrawal is often the final stage before indifference. Indifference is dangerous for any system that relies on participation. When people stop caring whether a system succeeds or fails, its collapse accelerates quietly. This is why the question of whether men will come back is secondary. The primary question is whether the conditions that led them to leave will change. Without that change, calls for re engagement sound hollow. People do not return to environments that have not addressed the reasons they left. It is also important to resist the temptation to frame this as a battle between men and women. That framing obscures the real issue. The issue is not gender, it is reciprocity. When reciprocity breaks down, any group will disengage given the opportunity. Some women are already recognizing this and expressing concern not out of entitlement, but out of genuine worry about social cohesion. Those voices matter. They represent an opportunity for a course correction. But that correction cannot be one sided. It must involve listening without defensiveness. Listening does not mean agreement, it means understanding the experience being described. Men who disengage are describing patterns, not issuing ultimatums. Ignoring those patterns because they are inconvenient does not make them disappear. This is where the phrase men walking away resonates. It is not a slogan of defiance, it is a description of motion. Walking away from conflict, walking away from constant evaluation, walking toward simplicity, autonomy, and calm. And as this walking away continues, society will have to decide whether it wants participants who feel valued or compliance from people who feel trapped. The former requires humility and change. The latter produces disengagement and eventual breakdown. One of the first areas affected is economic participation beyond basic employment. Men who disengage socially often still work, but they reduce their willingness to take on extra burdens that are not clearly rewarded. Over time, becomes less appealing. Leadership roles that require constant mediation and emotional labor lose their shine. Voluntary mentorship declines. Informal problem solving, the kind that keeps organizations running smoothly, quietly fades. These contributions were never mandated, but they were essential. When they disappear, inefficiency increases and strain spreads. Organizations respond in predictable ways. They attempt to formalize what was once informal. They add rules, policies, and procedures to compensate for lost goodwill. But rules cannot replace initiative. Policies cannot substitute for trust. As bureaucracy grows, satisfaction shrinks, reinforcing the cycle of disengagement. People do what is required and nothing more. The system continues, but it becomes brittle. Another area affected is innovation. Creativity thrives in environments where people feel psychologically safe. When individuals feel constantly evaluated or constrained by ambiguous expectations, they stop taking risks. Men who disengage often redirect creative energy into solitary pursuits or small independent projects rather than collaborative ventures. Innovation does not vanish, but it fragments. The collective momentum that comes from shared purpose weakens. This fragmentation also affects community life. Local groups, clubs, and associations rely heavily on unpaid effort. When men withdraw, these structures struggle to sustain themselves. Attendance drops. Leadership positions remain unfilled. Events shrink or disappear. The loss is not always dramatic, but it is cumulative. Community becomes thinner, less resilient. There is also an impact on intergenerational knowledge transfer. Older men who have stepped back are less likely to mentor younger ones, not out of spite, but out of a desire to avoid environments that feel unreceptive or risky. Younger men, lacking guidance, turn inward or online. They learn through trial and error rather than apprenticeship. This increases isolation and slows skill development. At the same time, younger men are observing the outcomes of earlier generations. They see the stress, the sacrifices, and the lack of appreciation. Many conclude that the traditional path is not worth the cost. This is not rebellion, it is pattern recognition. When outcomes do not match promises, belief erodes. Belief is central to social cohesion. People participate not just because they must, but because they believe participation matters. When belief fades, compliance replaces engagement. Compliance keeps systems functioning at a basic level, but it does not sustain them long term. Another dimension of disengagement involves emotional risk. Many men describe modern social interaction as requiring constant self monitoring. Words must be carefully chosen, intent must be explained, silence must be justified. This creates cognitive load. Over time, cognitive load becomes exhaustion. Withdrawal becomes recovery. Recovery is an important lens through which to view this shift. Men are not running away from responsibility. They are recovering from prolonged stress. Stress that was normalized, stress that was rarely acknowledged, stress that was often dismissed. When recovery begins, priorities change. Men become more selective. They ask whether interactions add value or drain it. They choose quality over quantity, fewer relationships, but clearer ones. Less noise, more focus. This selectivity can be misinterpreted as coldness or selfishness, but from the inside, it feels like self preservation. When someone has experienced chronic stress, boundaries become non negotiable. Peace is protected carefully. As this mindset spreads, cultural narratives that rely on guilt lose effectiveness. Appeals to duty fall flat when duty has felt one sided for too long. The language of obligation no longer motivates those who have restructured their lives around autonomy. This creates a challenge for institutions accustomed to compliance. They struggle to understand why messaging that once worked no longer does. They misdiagnose the problem as laziness, entitlement, or extremism. In reality, it is a shift in incentives. Incentives matter. People respond to environments that reward effort fairly. When rewards become symbolic or conditional, effort declines. Men who disengage are responding rationally to perceived incentive structures. Another important factor is reputational risk. In many social contexts, men feel that mistakes are punished more harshly than efforts are rewarded. The cost of a misstep feels high. The benefit of success feels uncertain. Rational actors reduce exposure to high risk, low reward scenarios. Withdrawal is the logical outcome, and this risk calculus is intensified by public shaming dynamics. Online discourse often amplifies mistakes, strips context, and assigns motive. Even those who avoid social media feel its effects through workplace policies and cultural norms. Men respond by minimizing situations where misinterpretation is possible. Minimization leads to isolation, but not necessarily loneliness. Many men replace social validation with self validation. They measure success internally rather than externally. This reduces dependence on approval and further weakens the pull of traditional social incentives. There is also a shift in how men view time. Time becomes a scarce resource to be guarded. Activities that do not clearly contribute to well being are cut. Socializing without purpose feels inefficient. Peace becomes the benchmark against which decisions are measured. This reorientation has profound implications for dating and partnership. Relationships that once relied on social pressure to persist now must justify themselves through mutual benefit. When they do not, men are increasingly willing to walk away early rather than invest years hoping for improvement. This early exit strategy is not cynical. It is pragmatic. It reflects a belief that prolonged imbalance is unlikely to resolve itself. Men are choosing to trust patterns rather than promises. As a result, relationship formation slows, commitment thresholds rise, expectations become clearer. This can be healthy when mutual respect exists. It becomes destabilizing when expectations remain one sided. Another overlooked effect is how disengagement influences conflict resolution. When people are willing to leave rather than argue, conflicts end quickly but without resolution. This prevents escalation, but also prevents repair. Over time, this reduces opportunities for growth and understanding. However, from the perspective of those who disengage, avoiding conflict is preferable to enduring cycles of blame. Peace is chosen over persuasion. The cumulative effect of these choices is a society with fewer informal bonds and more formal structures. More rules, fewer relationships, more policies, less trust. This is not sustainable indefinitely. Sustainability requires participation that is voluntary and valued. When participation becomes conditional or coerced, systems weaken. Now, it is important to emphasize that this is not a call to reverse progress or ignore legitimate concerns. It is a call to examine unintended consequences. Progress that alienates key participants undermines itself. Rebuilding engagement requires acknowledging discomfort on all sides. It requires redefining respect, not as compliance, but as consideration. It requires creating environments where effort is visible and appreciated. Without this recalibration, disengagement will continue. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, persistently. Men walking away are not seeking attention, they are seeking equilibrium. And equilibrium, once found, is rarely surrendered without compelling reason. One of the most significant downstream effects of this disengagement is demographic change. When men delay or avoid long term partnerships, family formation slows. Birth rates decline. This is already visible across many developed societies. While this trend is often discussed in terms of economics or lifestyle preferences, the relational dimension is frequently overlooked. When forming a family feels like entering a high risk arrangement with unclear protections, people hesitate. Hesitation at scale becomes demographic shift. Demographics matter because they shape everything from labor markets to social support systems. Fewer families mean fewer future workers. Fewer workers mean increased pressure on those who remain engaged. That pressure, if unmanaged, accelerates disengagement further. It is a reinforcing loop that policymakers struggle to address because it is rooted in trust rather than policy alone. Another consequence is the redefinition of success. Traditional markers such as marriage, home ownership tied to family life, and social status through partnership lose their centrality. Men who disengage often redefine success in terms of autonomy, stability, and peace. This redefinition is subtle but powerful. It changes consumption patterns, it changes career choices, it changes how people measure fulfillment. When fulfillment becomes internal rather than external, social influence weakens. Marketing messages lose effectiveness. Social pressure diminishes. People become harder to motivate through comparison. This can be liberating for individuals, but challenging for systems that rely on aspiration and conformity to function smoothly. There is also an impact on mental health discourse. Often, much of the existing framework assumes that connection and participation are universally beneficial. While connection is important, forced or imbalanced connection can be harmful, but men who disengage often report improved mental clarity and reduced anxiety. This challenges simplistic narratives that equate solitude with pathology. Solitude, when chosen, can be restorative. It allows reflection without judgment. It allows growth without performance. This distinction between chosen solitude and imposed isolation is crucial. Many men are choosing solitude precisely because it offers control over emotional exposure. Control, again, is not about power over others, it is about predictability. Predictability reduces stress. When social environments feel unpredictable, people retreat to spaces they can manage. This is a rational response, not an ideological one. As disengagement becomes normalized, it influences younger generations before they even fully participate. Young men observe older peers opting out and incorporate that into their expectations. They approach relationships cautiously. They invest heavily in self sufficiency. They treat commitment as optional rather than inevitable. This cautious approach is sometimes misinterpreted as lack of ambition or maturity. In reality, it reflects a recalibration of risk. When the perceived downside of commitment is high and the perceived upside uncertain, caution is logical. The same recalibration applies to communication. Men become more reserved, they share less, they disclose selectively. This is not emotional unavailability in the traditional sense, it is emotional efficiency. Sharing is reserved for contexts where it is likely to be received with care rather than judgment. As a result, conversations become narrower. Emotional depth exists, but it is compartmentalized. This can create misunderstandings with those who expect openness as a default. But openness without safety is unsustainable. Safety in this context is psychological. It is the assurance that intent will be considered alongside impact, that mistakes will be met with proportion rather than escalation. That disagreement will not automatically be framed as hostility. Where this safety is absent, withdrawal continues. Another long term effect is the reshaping of cultural narratives around masculinity. When traditional roles lose appeal and new roles are poorly defined, identity becomes fragmented. Men construct personal identities rather than adopting prescribed ones. This increases diversity of expression, but reduces shared reference points. Shared reference points are important for social cohesion. They provide common language and expectations. When they erode, coordination becomes harder. People talk past each other, misunderstandings increase. At the same time, this fragmentation creates pockets of innovation. Men experiment with new ways of living. Some form small, intentional communities. Others pursue creative or technical mastery. Others focus on physical health or spiritual practices. These paths are varied and often invisible mainstream discourse. Visibility matters because what is not seen is often misunderstood. When disengaged men are portrayed only through extremes or stereotypes, the quiet majority remains unseen. That invisibility reinforces misdiagnosis of the issue. Misdiagnosis leads to ineffective solutions. Programs designed to re engage men often focus on messaging rather than environment. They encourage participation without changing conditions. This rarely works. People do not respond to slogans when lived experience contradicts them. Effective re engagement would require structural humility. It would require institutions to ask not how to persuade men to return, but what conditions would make return worthwhile. This shift in framing is difficult because it challenges assumptions of moral authority. Authority without trust is fragile. When trust declines, authority relies increasingly on enforcement rather than consent. This is evident in expanding regulation and oversight. While some regulation is necessary, over reliance on it signals erosion of voluntary cooperation. Voluntary cooperation is the lifeblood of complex societies. It cannot be forced sustainably. When it diminishes, systems become rigid and brittle. Another subtle consequence of disengagement is how it affects conflict narratives. When men disengage rather than argue, public discourse loses counterbalance. This can create echo chambers where assumptions go unchallenged. Over time, this reduces the quality of decision making. Healthy disagreement is necessary for progress. When one group withdraws from debate, not because it lacks arguments, but because it lacks trust in the process, the conversation becomes skewed. Solutions become less robust. This withdrawal from discourse is often mistaken for agreement or apathy. In reality, it is disengagement from a process perceived as unfair. Rebuilding participation requires restoring confidence in dialogue itself. Confidence in dialogue depends on norms of fairness. When norms feel asymmetrical, people exit. This is not unique to men. Any group treated similarly would respond the same way. Understanding this universality is key to moving forward. The issue is not gendered grievance, it is systemic imbalance. As disengagement persists, it reshapes expectations of responsibility. Men take responsibility for themselves first. Collective responsibility becomes secondary. This shift has implications for crisis response. In times of collective stress, coordination becomes harder when trust is low. Historically, societies relied on shared norms to mobilize effort during crises. When those norms weaken, responses become fragmented. People prioritize personal safety and stability. This is adaptive in the short term, but risky long term. Risk accumulates quietly. Like disengagement itself, it does not announce itself dramatically. It becomes visible only when systems fail under pressure. And this is why ignoring disengagement is dangerous. Not because it is malicious, but because it removes redundancy from social systems. Redundancy provides resilience. When people withdraw, redundancy disappears. Resilience requires surplus goodwill. It requires people willing to step in when needed. When goodwill is depleted, resilience declines. Replenishing goodwill is possible, but it requires acknowledgement. It requires admitting that some approaches caused harm, even if unintentionally. It requires shifting from blame to repair. Repair is difficult because it requires vulnerability from institutions, not just individuals. It requires listening without defensiveness. It requires changing incentives, not just rhetoric. If such repair does not occur, disengagement will continue to normalize. Men walking away will become an accepted life path rather than a reaction. Once normalized, it becomes self reinforcing. Normalization changes narratives. What was once seen as unusual becomes unremarkable. This is already happening. Men choosing solitude are no longer automatically pitied. In some circles, they are admired for clarity and discipline. Admiration reinforces behavior. It signals that peace and autonomy are legitimate goals. This further weakens the pull of traditional expectations. As this shift matures, society will likely adapt in one of two ways. It will either recalibrate norms to restore reciprocity, or it will adjust to lower participation by formalizing and mechanizing functions once supported by goodwill. The second path leads to colder systems, more rules, less trust, more compliance, less engagement. The first path requires humility and balance. Which path prevails will depend on whether disengagement is interpreted as feedback or defiance. Treating it as defiance guarantees resistance. Treating it as feedback opens the door to reform. At this stage, the most important task is clarity. Clarity about what disengagement is and what it is not. It is not hatred. It is not nihilism. It is not a desire for collapse. It is a search for stability in an environment perceived as unstable. And men walking away are not rooting for failure, they are preparing for uncertainty. Preparation is not pessimism, it is prudence. As we turn toward the question of recalibration, it is important to stay grounded in realism rather than idealism. Recalibration does not mean returning to old norms unchanged, and it does not mean dismissing legitimate concerns that motivated earlier cultural shifts. It means adjusting expectations so that participation once again feels balanced rather than burdensome. This is not about winning an argument. It is about restoring functionality to relationships and systems that depend on mutual investment. The first element of meaningful recalibration is reciprocity. Reciprocity is not symmetry in every action, but fairness over time. It is the sense that effort is noticed, intent is considered, and contribution is valued. When men disengage, they are often responding to environments where reciprocity feels absent. Reintroducing it requires more than reassurance, it requires consistent experience. Consistency is critical because trust is built through repetition, not declarations. Men who have walked away did so after repeated experiences of imbalance. One positive interaction is not enough to counter years of strain. Recalibration, therefore, must be sustained, not symbolic. Another key component is clarity. Many men describe modern social expectations as ambiguous. Rules feel unwritten, shifting, and selectively enforced. This ambiguity creates anxiety. People cannot relax in environments where they do not know what is expected or what consequences might follow minor missteps. Clear norms reduce cognitive load and restore confidence. Clarity does not mean rigidity, it means transparency. It means stating expectations openly and applying them consistently. When expectations are clear, people can decide whether participation is worthwhile. When they are opaque, withdrawal becomes the safer option. Respect is another essential element. Respect is often discussed, but frequently misunderstood. Respect is not agreement, it is the willingness to treat someone's perspective as legitimate even when you disagree. Many men disengaged because they felt their perspectives were dismissed rather than debated. Recalibration requires restoring respect as a baseline rather than a reward. Restoring respect also involves how language is used. Language shapes atmosphere. When broad groups are described primarily in negative terms, even abstractly, individuals within those groups feel targeted. Over time, this erodes willingness to engage. Shifting language towards specificity rather than generalization reduces unnecessary friction. Another important factor is accountability that flows in all directions. Accountability that is perceived as one sided breeds resentment. Men are often willing to accept responsibility when it is fairly distributed. When accountability appears selective, trust collapses. Recalibration requires demonstrating that standards apply universally. This universality is not about punishment, it is about predictability. Predictability allows people to plan their behavior without fear of arbitrary consequences. When predictability is absent, people retreat. Incentives also play a central role. People engage when incentives align with effort. Incentives are not always material, they include appreciation, influence, and a sense of belonging. When these incentives are removed or replaced with scrutiny, engagement declines. Recalibration means restoring positive reinforcement for constructive participation. Another often overlooked element is forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring harm, it means allowing people to learn and move forward without permanent stigma. Environments that do not allow recovery from mistakes discourage participation. Men who disengage often cite fear of lasting reputational damage from minor errors. Introducing proportionality into responses reduces this fear. Proportionality is essential for trust. When responses escalate quickly, people become defensive. When responses match the severity of actions, people remain open. This balance is delicate but necessary. It is also important to recognize that not all disengagement is reversible, nor should it be. Some men have built lives around solitude and autonomy that genuinely suit them. Recalibration is not about forcing everyone back into participation. It is about ensuring that participation is attractive for those who want it. At the same time, recalibration must address structural incentives that currently reward disengagement. For example, when peace and stability are more accessible alone than within relationships or institutions, people choose the former. Making cooperative environments genuinely supportive shifts that calculus. Support does not mean absence of challenge. Challenge can be motivating when it is fair. What men often reject is challenge layered on top of constant suspicion. Removing suspicion restores the positive function of challenge. Another dimension involves listening without immediate rebuttal. Many conversations fail not because of disagreement, but because participants feel unheard. Men who disengaged often describe attempting to articulate concerns only to be met with dismissal or moral framing. Recalibration requires creating spaces where concerns can be expressed without immediate labeling. Labeling short circuits dialogue. Once someone is categorized, their content is ignored. This is efficient for shutting down debate, but costly for understanding. Reducing reliance on labels allows complexity to surface. Complexity is uncomfortable because it resists simple narratives, but simple narratives are part of what drove disengagement. Reintroducing nuance is necessary, even if it slows conversation. Another area for recalibration is expectation management. Expectations that are unrealistic or asymmetrical create pressure. When men feel expected to provide stability, protection, and emotional regulation without reciprocal support, burnout follows. Resetting expectations to reflect shared responsibility reduces this pressure. Shared responsibility must be visible to be credible. Statements alone are insufficient. People look for patterns. When patterns change, trust begins to rebuild. Time is another factor that must be acknowledged. Rebuilding trust takes time, and impatience undermines progress. Expecting immediate re engagement ignores the depth of previous strain. Recalibration is a gradual process. During this process, there will be resistance. Some will interpret recalibration as regression, others will see it as concession. Both interpretations miss the point. Recalibration is adaptation, not surrender. Adaptation has always been part of social evolution. Societies adjust norms in response to feedback. Disengagement is feedback. Ignoring it risks stagnation. Another practical step toward recalibration involves redefining contribution. Contribution is often measured narrowly, ignoring informal support and emotional labor. Recognizing a wider range of contributions validates effort that previously went unseen. Men who feel unseen disengage. Visibility restores motivation. Visibility also involves appreciation. Appreciation does not have to be exaggerated, it must be sincere. Sincere appreciation reinforces behavior. Its absence discourages it. It is also worth addressing how conflict is framed. Framing conflict as zero sum encourages withdrawal. Framing it as a shared problem encourages collaboration. Language that emphasizes common goals reduces defensiveness. Common goals must be articulated clearly. Vague appeals to harmony are less effective than concrete objectives. When people know what they are working toward, engagement increases. Another element is choice. Engagement must be voluntary to be meaningful. Pressure breeds resistance. Offering choice respects autonomy. Autonomy is highly valued by men who disengage. Respecting it creates goodwill. Goodwill cannot be manufactured, but it can be invited. Invitations differ from demands. Invitations allow people to opt in without losing dignity. Dignity is central to re-engagement. Men who disengaged often felt their dignity eroded through constant critique. Restoring dignity requires treating people as moral agents rather than problems to be managed. Management approaches that work in technical systems often fail in human ones. Humans respond to meaning, not just control. Recalibration requires shifting from control to collaboration. Collaboration thrives in environments where feedback is welcome. Welcoming feedback means tolerating discomfort. Avoiding discomfort leads to disengagement. Another consideration is scale. Not all solutions need to be national or cultural. Local environments can recalibrate independently. Workplaces, communities, and relationships can implement changes without waiting for broader shifts. These local successes can model new norms. Modeling is powerful. People are influenced by what they see working. When cooperative environments demonstrate balance and respect, they attract participation organically. Organic participation is sustainable. Coerced participation is not. It is also necessary to acknowledge that some narratives around disengagement exaggerate conflict. Sensationalism attracts attention but distorts reality. Most disengaged men are not hostile. They are quiet. Treating them as adversaries alienates them further. Quiet groups are easy to ignore until their absence is felt. By the time absence becomes visible, rebuilding engagement is harder. Early recognition matters. Recognition involves naming the issue accurately. Disengagement is not abandonment of society, it is selective participation. Men still contribute where they feel respected, they withdraw where they do not. Understanding this selectivity helps identify areas for improvement. Where participation remains strong, conditions are likely healthier. Where it declines, conditions need review. Review must be honest. Defensive postures block insight. Insight requires humility. Humility from institutions is rare but necessary. Admitting that certain approaches had unintended negative effects is not weakness, it is competence. Competence builds trust. Trust encourages engagement. Engagement sustains systems. As recalibration unfolds, patience will be tested. Some will demand quick fixes, others will resist any change. Progress will be uneven. But uneven progress is better than none. The alternative to recalibration is continued disengagement. Continued disengagement leads to thinner social fabric. Thinner fabric tears under stress. Stress is inevitable. Systems must be resilient. Resilience depends on voluntary cooperation. Voluntary cooperation depends on trust, reciprocity, clarity, and respect. These are not abstract ideals. They are practical requirements. Men walking away have highlighted where these requirements are unmet. Their withdrawal is information. The question is whether society will use that information constructively or dismiss it defensively. If used constructively, recalibration can strengthen relationships and institutions. If dismissed, disengagement will deepen and normalize. At this point, the path forward is visible. It is not easy, but it is clear. It involves listening, adjusting incentives, restoring balance, and allowing dignity to guide interaction. When participation declines, systems compensate by concentrating responsibility. The people who remain engaged are asked to do more. At first, they step up out of commitment or habit. Over time, the burden increases, fatigue sets in, burnout follows. Eventually, those individuals also reassess their participation. This is how disengagement spreads, not through ideology, but through experience. As disengagement becomes normalized, expectations shift. It becomes assumed that fewer people will volunteer, mentor, or take initiative. Systems adapt by lowering standards or increasing control. Neither solution restores trust. Lowering standards reduces quality. Increasing control reduces autonomy. Both reinforce the reason people disengaged in the first place. One of the most overlooked consequences of this process is how it affects crisis response. In moments of uncertainty or disruption, societies rely on informal cooperation. People help without being asked. They take responsibility without instruction. When goodwill is depleted, these responses weaken. Coordination becomes slower. Outcomes worsen. This is not because people are cruel, but because they no longer feel connected to a shared outcome. Shared outcomes depend on shared identity. Identity, in turn, depends on mutual recognition. When recognition erodes, identity fragments. People retreat into smaller circles or individual priorities. This makes large scale coordination difficult. This fragmentation also affects narrative coherence. Societies tell stories about who they are and what they value. When large groups disengage, those stories lose credibility. People no longer see themselves reflected in them. Cynicism replaces belief. Cynicism does not mobilize effort. Another long term effect is institutional overreach. As voluntary participation declines, institutions attempt to fill the gap with formal mechanisms. Rules multiply, oversight expands, enforcement increases. While this can maintain order in the short term, it is costly and inefficient. More importantly, it signals a breakdown of trust. Trust cannot be replaced by policy. Policy can constrain behavior, but it cannot inspire contribution. Contribution requires meaning. Meaning arises from feeling valued. Men who have walked away often describe a loss of meaning in traditional participation, work without recognition, relationships without reciprocity, contribution without appreciation. When meaning disappears, effort follows. It is also important to address a common misconception. Disengagement does not mean indifference to outcomes. Many men who disengage still care deeply about stability and continuity. They simply no longer see themselves as responsible for holding systems together alone. This distinction matters. It means disengagement is not nihilism, it is boundary setting. Boundary setting is often framed negatively, but it is a sign of self respect. People who respect themselves expect fair treatment. When fair treatment is absent, they withdraw. Withdrawal, however, has limits. If disengagement continues unchecked, society becomes more transactional. Interactions become calculated. Trust becomes rare. Relationships become fragile. This environment is not conducive to long term stability. At the same time, there are adaptive responses emerging. Some communities are recalibrating successfully. They prioritize clear norms. They value contribution visibly. They encourage dialogue without labeling. They allow mistakes without permanent stigma. These environments attract participation organically. Organic participation is the key. It cannot be forced, it must be earned. Earning participation requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some well intentioned approaches had unintended effects. It requires shifting from moral certainty to curiosity. Curiosity opens space for learning, certainty closes it. This humility is difficult because it challenges identity. Admitting missteps can feel like losing ground. In reality, it is how ground is regained. Trust is restored not by denying harm, but by addressing it. Another element of sustainable recalibration is patience. Cultural change is slow. People who disengaged will not return en masse overnight. Some will never return, and that is acceptable. The goal is not total re engagement, it is balance. Balance means that participation is one viable option among others, not an obligation enforced through guilt. When participation is chosen freely, its quality improves. Quality matters more than quantity. A smaller number of engaged participants is more valuable than a large number of resentful ones. Resentment corrodes systems from within. This brings us to an important realization. Men walking away are not the cause of instability. They are a symptom of imbalance. Treating symptoms without addressing causes leads to recurrence. Addressing causes requires examining incentives honestly. It requires asking who bears cost and who receives benefits. When costs are concentrated and benefits diffuse, participation declines. Redistributing responsibility more evenly reduces this decline. Shared responsibility creates shared ownership. Shared ownership creates investment. Investment is emotional as well as material. People invest when they feel seen, when they feel heard, when they feel respected. Respect does not require agreement, it requires acknowledgement. Many men disengaged because their experiences were dismissed rather than acknowledged. Restoring acknowledgement is foundational. Acknowledgement must be specific. Vague statements do not suffice. People respond to concrete changes, not abstract promises. Concrete changes might include clearer communication norms, fairer accountability, visible appreciation, and proportional responses to conflict. None of these are radical, they are practical. Practical solutions often lack drama, which makes them less appealing in sensational discourse, but they are effective. Another practical consideration is how narratives are framed. Narratives that emphasize conflict attract attention but discourage cooperation. Narratives that emphasize shared goals encourage engagement. Choosing narratives responsibly matters. Responsibility in storytelling does not mean avoiding hard truths. It means presenting them without dehumanization. Dehumanization accelerates disengagement. Humanizing perspectives requires effort. It requires listening without preparing rebuttals. It requires curiosity about experiences that differ from one's own. This effort must be mutual. One-sided listening breeds resentment. Mutual listening builds bridges. Bridges allow movement in both directions. They allow people to return if conditions improve. Burning bridges ensures permanent separation. Men walking away have not burned bridges. They have simply stepped back. The bridges remain, though they are less traveled. Whether those bridges see traffic again depends on whether the environment on the other side changes. Change is possible. It is not guaranteed. It requires intention. Intent alone is insufficient. Action must follow. Action must be sustained. Temporary gestures do not rebuild trust. Trust is rebuilt slowly, interaction by interaction. Each fair exchange adds weight. Each dismissal removes it. Over time, patterns emerge. People respond to patterns. If patterns shift toward balance, engagement increases. If they remain imbalanced, disengagement persists. At this stage, the choice is collective but enacted individually. Each interaction either reinforces withdrawal or invites participation. There is no single lever to pull, no single policy to implement. The work is distributed. Distributed work is challenging because it lacks a central authority, but it is also resilient. It adapts locally. Local recalibration can spread through example. People notice what works. They imitate success. Success in this context looks like calm environments, clear expectations, mutual respect, shared responsibility. These qualities attract those seeking peace without isolation. Peace is the common thread throughout this entire discussion. Men are not walking away to dominate or punish. They are walking away to preserve peace. Peace is not passive, it is actively maintained. It requires boundaries, it requires balance. When balance is restored, peace can exist within connection rather than apart from it. That is the opportunity ahead. Not a return to the past, but a refinement of the present. Refinement requires honesty. Honesty requires courage. Courage is not loud, it is steady. Steady change may not trend, but it endures. As we conclude, it is worth remembering that social systems are not abstract entities. They are collections of individuals making daily choices. Disengagement is one such choice. Re-engagement is another. Re-engagement, if it occurs, will not be driven by pressure. It will be driven by possibility. Possibility arises when people believe their participation will be met with fairness. Fairness is not perfection, it is effort. Effort reciprocated builds trust. Trust sustains cooperation. Cooperation sustains society. Without it, systems persist only through force or inertia. With it, systems thrive through voluntary participation. Men walking away have highlighted where cooperation faltered. Their silence is a signal. Whether that signal is heeded will shape the years ahead. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with this perspective or do you see it differently? Leave a comment on the video and share your thoughts, because this conversation is larger than any single viewpoint. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.